The cowboy saw the Apache slave hunted like an animal and chose to be her shield. Jake Callahan was a cowboy, one of the many who roamed the frontier, living on the edge of the law. He wasn't a man of many words, and he liked it that way. His horse, Whiskey, was his only real companion, and together they spent most of their days traveling from one dusty town to the next. Jake had made a name for himself as a tracker, a man who could find anyone, anywhere. But this time, his purpose was different. He wasn't chasing outlaws or searching for lost cattle. Today, he was after a group of men who had terrorized the nearby towns, raiding and killing without mercy. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jake's tired eyes caught a movement in the distance. He stopped his horse and squinted into the fading light, trying to make sense of the shadows. That's when he heard it. A faint cry, almost like a scream, carried by the wind. His hand tightened around the reins, and his gut twisted with a feeling he couldn't ignore. He followed the sound, steering Whiskey toward the dense woods that lay ahead. As he moved through the trees, the air grew thicker, and the ground became rougher beneath his boots. Then, as he pushed through the brush, he saw them. She was running, her breath coming in quick gasps, her wild eyes darting back in fear. Her skin was dark, her hair long and tangled, and she wore torn clothes that barely covered her. But it was the terror on her face that made Jake stop. She wasn't running from nature or an animal. She was running from men. 2 men, armed with rifles, were chasing her through the trees. Their shouts echoed through the forest, rough and cruel. They were laughing, enjoying the hunt, like hunters after their prey. Jake's heart tightened as he saw the fear in the woman's eyes. "She's nothing but property," one of the men shouted. "Catch her before she gets away. We don't want her getting any ideas about freedom." The second man, taller and more rugged, laughed as he wiped his brow. "Don't worry, she won't get far. And when we catch her, she'll learn what it means to be a slave." The woman stumbled, falling to the ground. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and she tried to push herself back up, but the men were getting closer. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. He had been a part of this land long enough to know right from wrong. And this was wrong. Without a second thought, he drew his revolver and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound of the shot stopped the men in their tracks, and they turned to face him. "Who's that?" the first man called out, his voice low and threatening. Jake didn't answer. Instead, he spoke to the woman, who was now scrambling to her feet, looking at him with wide, confused eyes. "Get on your feet." "I'm here to help you," he said, his voice steady. She froze, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. It was clear she didn't trust him. Who could blame her? But Jake wasn't about to let her be caught again. The second man raised his rifle, aiming at Jake. "Stay out of this, cowboy," he sneered. "This woman belongs to us. You're just asking for trouble." Jake's hand was already on the grip of his revolver. With quick precision, he aimed at the second man's rifle and fired, knocking the gun out of his hands. The man cursed and reached for another weapon, but Jake was faster. In one smooth motion, he fired again, this time hitting the man in the leg. He crumpled to the ground, howling in pain. The first man, now seeing that his partner was down, took a step back. "You'll pay for this," he yelled, but Jake could see the fear in his eyes. The cowboy was calm. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt this woman. "You've got 2 choices," Jake said, keeping his eyes on the man. "You can run, or I'll make you run. Your choice." The man hesitated, then looked at his injured partner. Without another word, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the trees. Jake didn't lower his gun until he was sure they were both gone. He let out a deep breath, his pulse slowing. Turning to the woman, he extended a hand. "Come on, we'll get you out of here." She stared at his hand, still wary. Jake knew she had been through too much to trust anyone easily, but he didn't know what else to say. He wasn't the kind of man to beg. He simply watched her, waiting for her to decide. After what seemed like an eternity, she took his hand. Her grip was strong, but she was trembling. She had every right to be afraid. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "Jake Callahan," he replied. "I'm a cowboy. And you're safe now." She nodded slowly but said nothing more. Jake helped her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. He could feel the tension in her back, and it was clear she didn't want to be close to him. Still, he wasn't going to leave her stranded in the wilderness. He had a sense of what was at stake here, and he wasn't about to let that woman fall into the hands of those men again. Jake and Diana rode together through the wilderness, the sound of their horses' hooves thundering across the dusty earth. As the sun began to set, the sky turned to soft purple, the stars starting to peek out one by one. The air was cool, but the tension between them remained thick. Ayana had not spoken much since the moment Jake had saved her. He had tried to strike up a conversation more than once, but each time she remained silent, her gaze fixed forward as if lost in thoughts of her own. Jake couldn't blame her. She had been through too much to trust anyone easily, especially someone like him, a stranger with no clear reason for helping her. They stopped by a small creek to water the horses and rest for the night. Jake pulled out a small bag of dried meat and some bread. He offered some to Ayana, but she shook her head. "I'm not hungry," she said softly, her voice distant. Jake watched her for a moment, then took a bite of his own meal. He wasn't one for talking much either, but something about the silence between them felt heavy. He didn't know much about her, only that she was Apache and that she had been hunted down like an animal. The thought of that made his blood boil. He had seen men do terrible things in his time, but this was different. He decided to break the silence. "Where are you from?" he asked. Ayana hesitated, then answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "My people were from the north. My tribe was taken." She paused as though reliving the memories. "I was captured by the raiders who killed them. They sold me down," putting to words. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her. He was used to hardship, but the cruelty she had faced was a kind of suffering he had never known. "Why didn't you fight back?" he asked, his voice gentle but curious. Ayana's eyes hardened. "I did," she replied quietly. "That they were too many, and they were too strong. I thought I would die, but instead they kept me alive. I became their slave." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. Jake could feel the weight of her words. He had been to war, had fought men who killed without thinking, but to be reduced to the status of property? It made him sick. He didn't know what to say to make it better, so he didn't say anything at all. Instead, he simply nodded and looked toward the horizon. The sun had completely set now, leaving only the dim glow of the stars to light the way. After a long pause, Ayana spoke again, this time her voice softer. "Thank you for saving me." Jake glanced over at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He wasn't used to receiving gratitude, especially not from someone who had been through as much as she had. "You don't need to thank me," he replied quietly. "I did what any man with a conscience would do." Ayana gave a small nod, though she seemed unsure if she fully believed him. She turned her gaze toward the fire they had built, staring into the flames as though they could offer her some kind of comfort. Jake sat beside her, resting his rifle against a nearby rock. The night was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. He wanted to ask her more questions, to know everything about her, her past, her tribe, what her life had been like before everything had fallen apart. But he didn't want to push her. She had already shared more than he expected. "I need to get you to a safer place," he said after a moment. "Somewhere the raiders can't find you." Ayana looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and fear. "And where is that?" she asked. Jake hesitated. He had no real plan. All he knew was that he had to keep her safe, even if it meant putting himself in danger. He thought about the small ranch he had passed a few days ago, far off in the hills. It was secluded, hidden from most prying eyes. "There's a place," he said, his voice steady. "It's a ranch far from here. The owners are good people. They won't turn you away." Ayana didn't say anything for a long time, her face unreadable. Jake could tell she wasn't sure whether to believe him or not. After all, her life had been filled with false promises and broken trust. She had no reason to think this man, this cowboy, was any different. "I don't want to be a burden," she finally said, her voice tight. "I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not a burden. You're just a woman who needs protection." Ayana's eyes softened at his words, and for a moment Jake thought he saw a flicker of something in her, a spark of hope, or maybe just the barest hint of trust. The next morning, they continued their journey. Jake kept a careful eye on the surroundings, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The days were long, and the landscape seemed to stretch on forever. The two of them rode in silence for the most part, though Ayana seemed to be slowly relaxing around him. One evening, as they stopped to rest for the night, Jake noticed that Ayana seemed restless. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes flicking nervously to the trees behind them. "What is it?" Jake asked, his voice low. "I think they're following us," she replied quietly, her face pale. Jake's hand instinctively went to his revolver, his gaze sharp as he scanned the distance. His heart began to race. He had known this moment would come. The raiders weren't going to stop looking for her, not after what had happened. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice steady. "We're going to make it through this." But in his heart, Jake wasn't sure. He didn't know if he could protect her from what was coming. All he knew was that he wouldn't let her fall back into their hands, not without a fight. The sound of galloping hooves echoed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. The raiders were closing in. The moon hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the canyon where Jake and Ayana had stopped to make camp. The fire crackled softly, the scent of burning wood mingling with the cold night air. Jake kept a sharp eye on the surrounding hills, but the raiders were still too far behind for him to see. That didn't stop the uneasy feeling from growing in his chest. The days had been long, the journey exhausting, but they couldn't afford to stop now. They had come too far, and with the raiders still chasing them, Jake knew they had to keep moving. His body ached, but he couldn't rest. Not yet. Ayana was quieter than usual, her eyes distant as she stared into the fire. She hadn't spoken much since they had noticed the raiders following them earlier that evening. Jake didn't know how to ease the tension between them. They had been through so much together, yet she still carried that wall around her heart, not fully trusting him or anyone else. "I don't know how much longer I can keep running," Ayana said suddenly, her voice soft but filled with concern. "They'll catch up sooner or later." "And then what?" Jake turned to look at her, surprised by the words. He had been so focused on keeping them both safe that he hadn't stopped to think about how she must feel. "We're not going to let them catch us," he replied, his voice firm. "You're not going back to them." "I promised you that." Ayana shook her head, her eyes dark and sad. "Promises don't always mean anything. I've heard too many before." Jake's heart tightened at the bitterness in her voice. He understood. She had been betrayed, captured, and treated like nothing more than a slave. He knew she didn't believe in promises anymore. Still, he couldn't help but try. "I'm not like the others," Jake said, his tone quieter now. "I know what it's like to lose everything. I won't abandon you." Ayana looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she looked away, staring out into the dark landscape. Jake couldn't tell if his words had reached her, but he hoped they had. He didn't expect her to trust him completely, not yet at least, but he could feel something shifting between them. A small glimmer of hope. "I'm not used to having someone looking out for me," Ayana said softly, almost as if to herself. Jake didn't know how to respond to that. He understood the feeling all too well. He had spent so many years alone, not relying on anyone, never trusting anyone. But now, it was different. He had a reason to fight, to protect her. "We don't have to do this alone," he said finally, his voice gentle. "You're not alone anymore." Ayana didn't respond, but Jake could see the tiny flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just exhaustion. But for the first time, he felt like she might be starting to believe him. The sound of hooves suddenly broke the silence, sharp and urgent in the still night. Jake's hand instantly went to the grip of his revolver, his body tensing as the sound grew louder. He stood up, motioning for Ayana to stay low. "They're here," he said, his voice low and steady. Ayana's eyes widened in fear, and Jake could see her body stiffen as she tried to decide whether to run or stay hidden. But there was nowhere to run. The canyon walls were too steep, and the raiders were too close. Jake quickly scanned the area. The fire was still burning, but the darkness around them would provide some cover. He needed to buy them time, enough to figure out a plan. But there was no time for that now. The raiders came into view, 3 men riding hard toward their camp. Jake's heart raced, but his hand stayed steady on his gun. He wasn't going to let them get to Ayana, not without a fight. One of the men, the leader, shouted as they approached, "There they are!" "Get them!" Jake didn't hesitate. He aimed and fired at the lead rider's horse, sending the animal rearing back in panic. The man shouted as he fell to the ground, cursing. The other 2 raiders pulled their guns, but Jake was already moving. He ducked behind a large rock, using it as cover as he fired again, hitting one of the raiders in the arm. The second raider fired back, missing by a wide margin as Jake dove to the side. He rolled behind another rock, his heart pounding. Ayana was still behind him, crouching low, her face a mask of fear. "They won't stop," Ayana said, her voice trembling. "What are we going to do?" He needed a plan. He couldn't take on all 3 of them at once, not without risking Ayana's safety. But there was something he could do. "Ayana," Jake said, his voice urgent, "I need you to trust me. When I give the signal, you need to run." Ayana looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Run? Where?" "Back the way we came," Jake replied quickly. "There's a hidden trail. You can make it." Ayana hesitated, but she nodded. I'll go when you tell me. Jake watched as the remaining 2 raiders slowly circled their camp, their guns drawn, waiting for him to show himself. They weren't stupid. They knew he was still out there. He had to move fast. He stood up, firing a shot that just missed one of the raiders. The man cursed and ducked, but Jake used the opportunity to move toward a different position, staying hidden as much as possible. "Ayanna!" Jake called, his voice sharp. Now, without a moment's hesitation, Ayanna ran, darting into the darkness, her footsteps light and quick. Jake watched her go, his heart in his throat. She was fast, and she had a head start. The 2 remaining raiders didn't see her at first, but once they did, they shouted, "Get her! Don't let her escape!" Jake knew that he had only a few moments before they turned their full attention back to him. He fired one last shot at the leader, hitting his rifle and sending it flying out of his hands. The raiders were momentarily distracted, and Jake took advantage of the confusion, moving quickly to follow Ayanna. The night was his cover, but the real battle was just beginning. Jake's heart pounded as he moved quickly through the darkness, his eyes searching for any sign of Ayanna. The night air was cold, and the sound of galloping hooves echoed through the canyon as the raiders followed her. His mind raced. He had to protect her. He couldn't let them take her back, no matter the cost. He had given Ayanna a head start, hoping she could find the hidden trail he had mentioned. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. The raiders would stop at nothing to catch her, and Jake had no intention of letting them succeed. He couldn't afford to wait for them to regroup and attack. Ayanna was fast, and she had a good chance of escaping, but the raiders were relentless. They had been hunting her for far too long, and they wouldn't give up now. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Jake knew the raiders were closing in. He ducked low behind a rock, taking a deep breath. His hands were steady, but his pulse raced. There was no more time for planning. This was it. He raised his rifle, aiming at the 2 men who were now in sight. They were riding hard, their horses kicking up dirt as they came toward him. Jake knew he only had 1 shot before they saw him. He took a deep breath and fired, hitting the first rider in the shoulder. The man cried out, falling off his horse and hitting the ground hard. The second raider pulled his gun, aiming at Jake, but before he could fire, Jake was already moving. Jake quickly rolled to the side, narrowly dodging the raider's bullet. He kept low, using the rocks for cover, as the raider continued to fire. The second man was faster than Jake had anticipated, and he didn't want to risk exposing himself for too long. He had to make this count. With a swift move, Jake darted forward, closing the distance between himself and the raider. The man barely had time to react before Jake tackled him to the ground. They struggled for a moment, each of them trying to gain control. Jake's hands tightened around the raider's throat as he pushed him down, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The raider fought back, but Jake was stronger, fueled by a mix of anger and fear. He couldn't let them win, not when it came to Ayanna. With one final push, Jake knocked the man out cold. He stood up, breathing heavily, wiping the sweat from his brow. There was no time to waste. He had to find Ayanna and get her to safety. But before he could move, he heard the sound of more hooves approaching. Another group of raiders. Jake's heart sank. He had to keep fighting. He wasn't about to let them take Ayanna. He grabbed his rifle and quickly climbed to higher ground, positioning himself where he had a clear view of the trail. He could hear their voices now, laughing as they rode toward him. They had no idea what they were walking into. Jake took aim, his fingers steady on the trigger. The first raider came into view, riding confidently toward the spot where Jake had been hiding. Jake fired, the bullet hitting the raider's horse. The animal screamed in pain, throwing its rider to the ground. The other raiders reacted quickly, drawing their guns as they looked for the source of the shot. Jake fired again, hitting one of them in the arm. The raider stumbled, dropping his gun. But there was still more of them. Too many for Jake to take on alone. He needed a plan. That's when he saw it. Ayanna. She was running, her feet quick and light, her face determined. She had made it to the trail. She had heard the shots and knew it was time to move. Jake's heart surged with pride. She was strong. She was brave, but she was still running. "Ayanna!" Jake shouted, his voice loud enough to carry over the noise of the raiders. "Head to the north! There's a cabin! Go!" She hesitated for a moment, but then she turned and ran toward the cabin. She was trusting him. She was trusting that he would get them out of this. Jake kept firing, his rifle steady in his hands. He could hear the raiders getting closer, but he knew Ayanna had a head start. That was all he needed. One of the raiders took a shot at him, narrowly missing. Jake ducked behind a boulder, his heart racing. He couldn't let them catch her. He had to keep moving. He had to give her the chance to escape. The raiders were still coming. But they weren't fast enough. They were losing ground. Jake stood up, quickly checking the distance between him and the approaching raiders. They were only a few hundred yards away. Ayana was already ahead of them. But the leader of the raiders, the one who had captured Ayana in the first place, was still coming after her. Jake could see him now, his face twisted with anger, his eyes locked on Ayana. Jake didn't hesitate. He aimed his rifle one last time, taking careful aim at the leader. The man's eyes widened as he saw the rifle trained on him. He reached for his own gun, but it was too late. Jake fired. The bullet hit its mark, the raider's gun falling from his hand as he tumbled from his horse. He didn't get up. Jake didn't wait to see if the other raiders would try to come after him. He turned and ran toward the cabin, the sound of his boots pounding against the earth. He could see Ayana now, just ahead of him, her eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. She was almost there. When they reached the cabin, Jake didn't stop to catch his breath. He pushed open the door and quickly ushered Ayana inside. He slammed the door shut behind them, locking it as quickly as he could. The cabin was small, but it was safe. For now. Jake turned to Ayana, his breath heavy. "You're safe. We're safe." Ayana looked at him, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had made it. She had escaped. She was free. Jake couldn't help but smile. "We did it." Ayana didn't say anything at first, but then, slowly she walked over to him. She took his hand in hers, her grip strong. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Jake squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with pride. He hadn't done this for gratitude, but hearing her say those words meant more than anything. They had made it through the storm together, and now they had each other.